The winter wind howled like a banshee across the frozen Nebraska plains as Emma Carson pressed her face against the frost-covered window of her remote trading post. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out the outline of her barn, though it stood only 50 yards away. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days now, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the coffee in her cup seemed to freeze before she could drink it. What she saw next, through that wall of white, would change her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A dark figure stumbled through the snow, falling to his knees, just 20 feet from her door. Even through the blinding storm, Emma could see the crimson stain spreading across the snow beneath him. Someone was hurt, badly hurt, and dying in the worst blizzard Wyoming Territory had seen in a decade. Emma Carson had never expected to find herself running a trading post on the edge of nowhere at 24 years old. The daughter of a Methodist minister from Ohio, she'd arrived in Sweetwater Creek just 18 months earlier with her husband David and dreams of building a prosperous life on the frontier. The trading post sat at the confluence of 2 major Native American trading routes where the Omaha, Cheyenne, and Lakota peoples had conducted commerce for generations. David had been convinced they could build something meaningful here, a bridge between the white settlements and the tribal nations that still controlled vast stretches of the territory. Their one-room cabin attached to the trading post was modest, but sturdy, built from local timber with thick sod walls that could withstand the brutal Wyoming winters. Emma had painted the interior walls a cheerful yellow and hung curtains made from fabric traded by a Lakota woman named Morning Star. The trading post itself was larger, filled with goods that ranged from coffee and sugar to ammunition and blankets. Emma had learned to speak basic Omaha and Lakota from her customers, and she prided herself on fair dealing that had earned respect from both white settlers and native traders. But David was gone now, claimed by pneumonia during the previous winter, leaving Emma alone to manage the trading post and survive in one of the most isolated spots in the territory. Her nearest white neighbors, Mark and Rhea Thompson, lived 12 miles away on a struggling ranch. The closest town, Fort Bridger, was a hard day's ride through terrain that could turn deadly without warning. Most people had advised Emma to sell the trading post and return east after David's death, but she had refused. This place had become her home, and the relationship she had built with the local tribes felt too precious to abandon. The winter of 1876 had been particularly harsh. Supply wagons from the railroad couldn't make it through the mountain passes, and Emma's stockroom was running dangerously low. She had been rationing her own food for weeks, keeping the best supplies available for trading with the native families, who depended on the post for ammunition, medicine, and other essentials they couldn't produce themselves. Emma understood that her survival was intertwined with theirs. If she could maintain the trust and respect of the tribal traders, she might make it through until spring. If not, she would face the winter alone and likely perish. The isolation had been the hardest part. During the summer months, the trading post bustled with activity as hunting parties, trading expeditions, and traveling families stopped to exchange goods and news. Emma had grown to love these interactions, learning about different tribal customs and sharing stories of her own background. She had developed a particular friendship with Running Wolf, an elderly Omaha man who served as a diplomat between his people and the white settlements. Running Wolf had taught her the significance of various tribal symbols and had even given her a set of beaded moccasins made by his wife as a token of respect for her fair dealing. But winter brought a different reality. The brutal cold made travel dangerous, and the trading post could go weeks without a single visitor. Emma spent her days maintaining her equipment, mending clothes, and reading the same few books over and over again. She talked to herself constantly, just to hear a human voice. The silence could be maddening, broken only by the endless howling of wind and the occasional coyote call in the distance. Some nights she wondered if she was slowly losing her mind in the vast emptiness of the frontier. 3 days ago, the blizzard had arrived with a ferocity that surprised even Emma, who had experienced Wyoming winters before. The wind drove snow horizontal across the plains, creating drifts that could bury a horse and rider in minutes. The temperature plummeted to levels that made exposed skin freeze in seconds. Emma had prepared as best she could, bringing extra firewood inside and melting snow for water, but she knew that if the storm continued much longer, her fuel would run out, and she would face a choice between burning her furniture or freezing to death. The storm had also brought an eerie quality to the landscape. The constant wind created a white void that seemed to swallow sound and sight beyond a few feet. Emma found herself questioning whether the shapes she glimpsed through the snow were real or products of her storm-fevered imagination. Twice she had thought she saw riders approaching, only to realize she was looking at wind-blown trees or her own barn appearing and disappearing in the swirling white. Now, staring through the window at the figure collapsed in her yard, Emma faced a decision that would test everything she had learned about frontier survival. Opening her door in this storm meant risking her own life. The wind could slam the door shut behind her, leaving her trapped outside to freeze. The cold was so intense that even a few minutes of exposure could cause frostbite or worse. But leaving someone to die just yards from safety violated every principle of frontier hospitality and Christian charity that had shaped her upbringing. Emma pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and grabbed a rope from beside the door. She tied one end around her waist and the other to the door handle, creating a lifeline that would guide her back to safety. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the howling storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over, and the snow stung her exposed skin like tiny needles. Emma forced herself forward, following the rope toward where she had seen the figure fall. Each step was a battle against the wind, and she could barely see her own feet in the swirling white chaos. She found him face down in a snowdrift, unconscious and bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was a young native man, probably in his 20s, wearing traditional Omaha clothing beneath a heavy buffalo coat. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers, and his moccasins were decorated with intricate beadwork that Emma recognized as particularly fine craftsmanship. But what caught her attention most was the amount of blood staining the snow around him. Whatever had wounded him was serious, and he was losing blood fast. Emma knew she had to act quickly. She grabbed the man under his arms and began dragging him toward her cabin, following the rope that led back to safety. The wind fought her every step, and the man's weight made progress agonizingly slow. Her muscles burned with effort, and she could feel the cold penetrating through her heavy clothing. Twice, the wind nearly knocked them both over, and she had to stop to regain her balance and her grip on the rope. By the time she reached her door, Emma was exhausted and shivering uncontrollably. She managed to drag the unconscious man inside and immediately shut the door against the storm. The sudden silence felt almost deafening after the constant howling of the wind outside. Emma's cabin, which had felt cold just minutes before, now seemed wonderfully warm by comparison to the deadly freeze outside. She quickly examined the man's wound by lamplight. He had been shot in the shoulder, and the bullet was still lodged in the muscle. The wound was serious but not immediately fatal if she could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. Emma had learned basic medical skills from David, who had served as a field medic during the Civil War, and she had treated injured traders and travelers before. But she had never dealt with a gunshot wound this severe, especially not during a blizzard that made it impossible to seek help from anyone else. Emma built up the fire and heated water while she gathered her medical supplies. She had laudanum for pain, clean cloth for bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for sterilization. She also had a set of surgical instruments that David had left behind, though she had never used them for anything more serious than removing splinters. Looking at the unconscious man's pale face, Emma realized that his life was now entirely in her hands. The man stirred as Emma began cleaning the wound, and his eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, alert despite his pain, and they fixed on Emma's face with a mixture of confusion and wariness. He spoke something in Omaha that Emma didn't understand, but his tone suggested a question. Emma smiled reassuringly and spoke in the limited Omaha phrases she had learned from running. "Wolf, you are safe," she said haltingly in his language. "I help you." The man's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. He seemed to understand that Emma meant no harm, though Emma could see him evaluating his surroundings and his situation. Being helpless in a white woman's cabin during a blizzard was not a position any Omaha warrior would choose, but he apparently recognized that Emma had saved his life by bringing him inside. "My name is Emma," she said in English, pointing to herself. "What is your name?" The man considered for a moment before answering. "I am called Tall Bear," he said, in accented but clear English. You pulled me from the snow." Emma nodded. "You were wounded, shot. I need to remove the bullet." Tall Bear's jaw tightened, but he nodded understanding. He had clearly dealt with combat injuries before and knew what was necessary. Emma offered him the laudanum, but he shook his head, preferring to remain conscious during the procedure. She gave him a piece of leather to bite down on instead and began the difficult work of extracting the bullet. The procedure took nearly an hour. Emma worked carefully, knowing that any mistake could cost Tall Bear his life or the use of his arm. The young warrior endured the pain with stoic silence, though sweat beaded on his forehead and his muscles tensed with each probe of Emma's instruments. When she finally extracted the bullet and began stitching the wound closed, Tall Bear managed a weak smile. "You have steady hands," he said, "like a medicine woman of my people." Emma finished bandaging the wound and helped Tall Bear drink some warm broth. As color returned to his face, she began to wonder about the circumstances that had brought him to her door. Who had shot him, and why was he traveling alone during such a dangerous storm? But those questions could wait. For now, the most important thing was helping him recover his strength. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage with undiminished fury. Emma realized that Tall Bear would be staying in her cabin for at least several days, possibly longer if the storm persisted. She had never been alone with a native man for an extended period, and she wondered how the situation might be perceived by both white settlers and tribal communities if word got out. But those concerns seemed trivial compared to the simple moral imperative of helping someone in need. As night fell and the wind continued to howl around her cabin, Emma settled into a chair beside the fire while Tall Bear rested on her bed. She had given him her sleeping space and would make do with blankets on the floor, a small sacrifice considering that he was recovering from a serious wound. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the storm outside created an odd sense of intimacy and isolation that made normal social conventions seem irrelevant. Emma found herself studying Tall Bear's face as he slept. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. His features were strong and symmetrical, and even in sleep there was a dignity about him that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. The beadwork on his clothes was exceptionally fine, suggesting that he was someone of importance in his tribe. Emma wondered what circumstances had led such a person to be alone and wounded in the middle of a blizzard. She also wondered about his family and friends, who must be worried about his disappearance. The storm made it impossible for anyone to search for him, but when it cleared, there would certainly be people looking. Emma hoped that when they found him, they would understand that she had helped rather than harmed him. Relations between white settlers and native tribes in this region were tense at best, and misunderstandings could easily lead to violence. As the night wore on, Emma dozed fitfully in her chair, waking periodically to check on Tall Bear's condition and add wood to the fire. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature outside seemed to be dropping even further. Emma had lived through many frontier winters, but this blizzard felt different, more intense and sustained than anything she had experienced before. She began to worry that even her well-built cabin might not be enough protection if the storm continued much longer. During one of her wakeful periods, Emma heard Tall Bear speaking softly in his own language. At first, she thought he might be delirious from fever, but when she approached to check on him, she realized he was praying. The words were beautiful and rhythmic, and though Emma couldn't understand them, she sensed the deep spirituality behind them. When he finished, Tall Bear opened his eyes and looked at her. "I was thanking the spirits for sending me to a good person," he explained quietly, "and asking them to protect this house from the storm." Emma felt touched by his words. "I was just doing what anyone would do," she said. Tall Bear shook his head. "Many would not. Many white people see only an Indian, not a person who needs help." The simple truth of his statement made Emma uncomfortable, because she knew it was accurate. Relations between whites and native peoples in the territory were characterized more by fear and suspicion than by understanding and cooperation. Emma had been fortunate to develop positive relationships with some tribal traders, but she knew that many settlers viewed all native people as threats to be avoided or eliminated. "I hope your people will understand that I meant to help you," Emma said. Tall Bear studied her face for a moment. "My people will understand," he said, "but others may not. You have taken a risk by helping me." Emma nodded, acknowledging the truth of his observation. But as she looked at this young man who had nearly died in the snow outside her door, she felt certain she had made the right choice. Whatever consequences might follow from her decision to shelter him, she could live with them more easily than she could have lived with letting him freeze to death. The second day of Tall Bear's recovery brought no break in the storm, but his strength was clearly returning. He was able to sit up and eat solid food, and the color had returned to his face. Emma learned that he was indeed a person of some importance among the Omaha people, serving as a scout and translator for his band. He had been traveling to a meeting with Cheyenne leaders when he was ambushed by a group of white men who had been stealing horses from tribal herds. "They thought I had information about where my people keep their horses," Tall Bear explained. "When I would not tell them, they shot me and left me to die." Emma felt anger rising in her chest at the thought of men who would shoot an unarmed traveler and leave him to freeze. The frontier attracted some truly dangerous people, men who saw law and morality as obstacles to getting what they wanted. She had encountered such individuals before and had learned to be wary of strangers who appeared at her trading post. "Do you know who they were?" Emma asked. Tall Bear nodded grimly. 3 men, one with a scar across his cheek, one very fat, one young with yellow hair. They have done this before, I think. They knew too much about tribal movements. Emma made mental notes of these descriptions, thinking she might be able to pass the information along to someone who could do something about these criminals. The territorial marshal was supposed to investigate crimes against native people, though Emma knew that in practice such investigations were often perfunctory. On the third day, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind died down from a howl to a whisper, and occasional breaks in the clouds allowed glimpses of blue sky. Emma knew that it would still be dangerous to travel, but the worst of the blizzard seemed to be passing. She also knew that once the weather cleared completely, people would begin moving again, and questions would be asked about Tall Bear's whereabouts. "My people will come looking for me soon," Tall Bear said, echoing Emma's thoughts. "When they do not find my body where I was shot, they will search wider." Emma nodded. "What should I tell them?" Tall Bear considered the question carefully. "Tell them the truth, that you found me wounded and gave me shelter. My uncle Running Wolf knows you. He will speak for your character." Emma felt relieved to learn that Tall Bear was related to Running Wolf, the elderly diplomat she had come to respect and trust. Running Wolf's endorsement would carry significant weight with the Omaha people and might prevent any misunderstandings about her motives in sheltering Tall Bear. "Running Wolf is your uncle?" Emma asked. Tall Bear smiled. "He speaks of the white woman with yellow hair, who trades fairly and shows respect for our customs. He said you are learning our language, and that you understand the proper way to conduct business with our people." Emma felt pleased by Running Wolf's assessment. She had worked hard to build positive relationships with the tribal traders who visited her post, and it was gratifying to know that her efforts were recognized and appreciated. As the fourth day dawned clear and cold, Emma knew that Tall Bear's people would soon arrive. She helped him dress and checked his wound one final time. The bleeding had stopped completely, and there were no signs of infection. With rest and care, his shoulder would heal completely, though he would always carry a scar from the bullet. "You have saved my life," Tall Bear said as they waited for his people to arrive. "Among the Omaha, such a debt is not forgotten." Emma shook her head. "You owe me nothing. I did what anyone with a heart would do." But Tall Bear's expression was serious. "You do not understand. What you have done will be remembered by my people for generations. You risked your own life to save mine, and you asked for nothing in return. This is the kind of action that creates bonds between peoples." Around midday, Emma heard the sound of horses approaching. Looking out her window, she saw a group of about 20 Omaha riders emerging from the tree line near her trading post. They rode in formation, alert and ready for trouble, clearly searching for their missing scout. Emma recognized Running Wolf among them, along with several other men she had traded with over the months. Tall Bear walked outside with Emma beside him, moving slowly but under his own power. The riders saw him immediately and spurred their horses forward. Emma watched as the young warrior was welcomed back by his people with obvious relief and joy. Running Wolf dismounted and embraced his nephew, then turned to Emma with an expression of deep gratitude. "You have done a great thing," Running Wolf said in English. "Tall Bear is precious to our people. Without him, we would have lost one of our finest young men." Emma felt embarrassed by the praise. "I only did what was right." But Running Wolf shook his head. "You did more than what was right. You did what was brave and good. For this, you will always be welcome among the Omaha people." The other riders had dismounted and were examining Tall Bear's wound and listening to his account of what had happened. Emma could see them looking at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to respect. She knew that word of her actions would spread quickly through the tribal community, but she hoped it would be seen as a positive development rather than a complication. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, spoken of in Omaha oral tradition for generations to come, and remembered by Emma Carson for the rest of her long life as the most extraordinary moment she ever experienced on the frontier. Running Wolf stepped closer to Emma, his weathered face bearing an expression she had never seen before. The elderly diplomat, who had always been formal and respectful in their trading interactions, now looked at her with something approaching awe. The other Omaha warriors had formed a semicircle around them, their horses pawing the snow restlessly, as if sensing the significance of the moment. "There is something you must know," Running Wolf said, his voice carrying a weight that made Emma's heart race. "Something about who you have saved, and what this means for both our peoples." Tall Bear looked uncomfortable, shooting a warning glance at his uncle. "Uncle, perhaps this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," Running Wolf interrupted, firmly. "She has earned the right to know the truth." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. There was something in the way the warriors were looking at her, something in the careful way they positioned their horses, that suggested this moment was far more significant than a simple rescue and reunion. "What truth?" Emma asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Running Wolf gestured toward Tall Bear with obvious pride and reverence. "The young man you saved is not merely a scout or translator. He is Tall Bear, who walks with thunder, grandson of Chief Standing Eagle, heir to the leadership of our band and keeper of our most sacred traditions." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She stared at Tall Bear, seeing him now with completely different eyes. No wonder his clothing was so fine, his bearing so dignified even in pain. She had not simply saved a tribal scout. She had saved a prince, a future chief whose death would have been a catastrophic loss to his people. "I had no idea," Emma whispered, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. Tall Bear stepped forward, his expression serious, but kind. "It would not have mattered if you had known. You did not save me because of my position in the tribe. You saved me because I was a human being in need of help. That is what makes your actions so powerful." Running Wolf nodded approvingly. "Among our people, we believe that the spirits arrange certain meetings for purposes beyond our understanding. The fact that Tall Bear was led to your door during the worst storm of the winter and that you risked your life to save him is not coincidence. It is destiny." Emma looked around at the assembled warriors, noting for the first time the richness of their clothing and equipment. These were not ordinary hunting parties or trading groups. The horses were magnificent animals, the weapons were beautifully crafted, and several of the men wore ceremonial ornaments that spoke of high rank within the tribe. This was a royal search party, sent to find their missing prince. "There is more," Running Wolf continued, his voice growing even more solemn. "3 nights ago, during the worst of the storm, our holy man, White Crow, received a vision. He saw Tall Bear lying wounded in the snow, and he saw a woman with yellow hair pulling him to safety, but he also saw something else, something that has shaken our entire band." Emma waited, her heart pounding, as she sensed that whatever Running Wolf was about to reveal would change everything she thought she knew about her simple act of compassion. "White Crow saw the sacred white horses," Running Wolf said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "In his vision, they surrounded the woman who saved our prince, marking her as chosen by the spirits themselves." The words seemed to hang in the cold air like a visible presence. Emma had heard references to sacred white horses in her conversations with tribal traders over the months, but she had never fully understood their significance. Now, looking at the faces of the Omaha warriors, she could see that whatever these horses represented was of profound importance to their spiritual beliefs. Tall Bear's expression had grown troubled. "Uncle, you're frightening her. She doesn't understand what this means." "Then we must help her understand," Running Wolf replied, "because what happened here will affect not just our 2 peoples, but the entire future of this territory." Emma felt as if the world was tilting beneath her feet. All she had done was drag a wounded man out of a snowstorm and tend his injuries. How could such a simple act of human kindness have such far-reaching implications? "Please," she said, her voice barely steady, "help me understand. What are these sacred white horses? Running Wolf looked around at his companions, who nodded, their encouragement for him to continue. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cadence of someone sharing ancient wisdom passed down through generations. Long ago, when the world was young, the Great Spirit gave our people a gift to help us recognize those who were truly blessed by the divine. The sacred white horses appear only to mark individuals who have been chosen for a special purpose, people whose actions will bridge the gap between different worlds and bring peace where there has been conflict. Emma listened intently, trying to process the spiritual significance of what she was hearing, while grappling with the practical implications for her own life. The last time the sacred white horses appeared to our people was 47 years ago. Running Wolf continued. They surrounded a Lakota woman who saved the life of an Omaha child during a cholera epidemic. Her actions led to a peace treaty between our tribes that lasted for 2 decades and prevented countless deaths. The weight of expectation in the assembled warriors' faces was almost overwhelming. Emma realized that they saw her not just as a good Samaritan who had helped one of their own, but as a prophetic figure whose actions might herald a new era of cooperation between whites and native peoples. "But I'm just a trader," Emma protested. "I run a small post in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any special powers or divine calling. I just couldn't let someone freeze to death in my yard." Tall Bear stepped closer, his dark eyes intense with conviction. "That is exactly why the spirits chose you. You acted without thought of reward or recognition, without considering the consequences for yourself. You saw a fellow human being in need and responded with pure compassion. That is the rarest and most powerful kind of courage." One of the other warriors, a middle-aged man with intricate face paint, spoke up for the first time. "I am Stormcaller, brother to Chief Standing, eagle and uncle to Tall Bear. I have seen many winters and many conflicts between our peoples. What you have done gives me hope that perhaps the killing and mistrust can finally end." Emma felt the crushing weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. These people were looking at her as if she held the key to resolving decades of tension and violence between white settlers and native tribes. The responsibility felt impossible to bear. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked quietly. Running Wolf exchanged glances with Stormcaller and the other senior warriors before answering. "We expect you to be yourself, to continue treating all people with the fairness and respect you have shown, and to understand that your actions will be watched closely by both our peoples, because you have become a symbol of what is possible when fear and prejudice are set aside." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses from the east. Emma turned to see a group of white riders emerging from the tree line, moving at a fast gallop across the snow-covered plain toward her trading post. Even at a distance, she could recognize Mark Thompson's distinctive gray horse and his wife Rhea's smaller bay mare. But there were at least 6 other riders with them, and something about their urgent pace suggested trouble. The Omaha warriors immediately moved into defensive positions, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The approaching white riders were still too far away to identify clearly, but the sudden tension in the air suggested that the peaceful moment of understanding was about to be shattered by the harsh realities of frontier politics. "Those are my neighbors," Emma said quickly, hoping to prevent any misunderstandings. "Mark and Rhea Thompson from the ranch to the east, but I don't know who the others are." Running Wolf's expression had hardened into the careful mask of a diplomat, preparing for difficult negotiations. "Word travels fast on the frontier. Someone saw our search party and reported armed Indians near your trading post." Emma's heart sank as she realized what was probably happening. Some well-meaning settler had spotted the Omaha warriors and assumed they posed a threat to the isolated white woman at the trading post. The approaching riders were likely a hastily assembled rescue party, armed and ready for conflict based on incomplete information and cultural prejudices. "I have to stop this," Emma said, starting toward the approaching riders. Tall Bear caught her arm gently. "Be careful. Fear makes people do dangerous things. These men may not listen to reason. If they believe you are in danger—" The approaching riders had closed to within 100 yards and were clearly preparing for some kind of confrontation. Emma could see rifle barrels glinting in the winter sunlight and recognized the grim expressions of men who believed they were riding to rescue a helpless woman from savage attackers. "Mark!" Emma called out as loudly as she could, waving her arms above her head. "Everything is fine. These men are my friends." But the riders continued their advance, and Emma could see that some of them were strangers whose faces bore the hard lines of men who viewed all Indians as enemies. She realized with growing dread that her simple act of compassion was about to spark exactly the kind of violent confrontation that Running Wolf had hoped her actions might help prevent. Mark Thompson reached the trading post first, his horse sliding to a stop in the snow as he took in the scene before him. His weather-beaten face showed confusion as he tried to reconcile Emma's apparent safety with the presence of 20 armed Omaha warriors. "Emma?" Mark called out, his voice tight with concern. "Are you hurt? We heard there were Indians surrounding your place." "I'm perfectly fine, Mark," Emma replied firmly. "These men came looking for their friend, who I helped during the storm. Everything is peaceful here." But the other riders were spreading out in what looked suspiciously like a combat formation, and Emma could see weapons being readied for use. The Omaha warriors had responded by closing ranks around Tall Bear and Running Wolf, their own hands moving toward their weapons in response to the obvious threat. One of the strangers, a lean man with cold eyes and a deputy marshal's badge, spurred his horse forward past Mark. "Ma'am, you need to step away from those Indians and let us handle this situation." "There is no situation to handle," Emma said, her voice rising with frustration. "These people are not threatening anyone. They came to retrieve their friend, who I treated for a gunshot wound." The deputy marshal's expression grew suspicious. "Gunshot wound? Who shot him?" Emma gestured toward Tall Bear, who stood quietly beside his uncle despite the growing tension. "He was ambushed by horse thieves 3 days ago. White men who shot him and left him to die in the blizzard." "That's a serious accusation, ma'am," the deputy said. "Do you have any proof of these claims?" Before Emma could answer, Running Wolf stepped forward with the dignity of a man accustomed to speaking for his people. "I am Running Wolf, speaker for Chief Standing Eagle of the Omaha Nation. The woman speaks the truth. My nephew was attacked by white criminals while traveling on legitimate business." The deputy's hand moved closer to his weapon. "I don't recognize any legitimate business that puts armed Indians in the territory without proper authorization." Emma felt the situation spiraling toward violence and knew she had to act quickly. "Deputy, these people have every right to travel through this territory. They were searching for a missing member of their family, and they found him safe because I was able to help him." "The woman has done nothing wrong," Stormcaller added, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief. "She saved the life of our prince with great courage and kindness. She should be honored, not threatened." The word prince seemed to have an electric effect on the white riders. Emma could see several of them exchanging worried glances as they realized they might be confronting someone of much greater importance than they had anticipated. Mark Thompson, who had been listening carefully to the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Wait a minute. Are you saying Emma saved the life of an Indian prince?" "The grandson of Chief Standing Eagle," Running Wolf confirmed proudly, "the heir to leadership of our band and keeper of our sacred traditions." Emma watched as the deputy marshal processed this information, clearly trying to determine whether it made the situation more or less dangerous. The presence of native royalty could either elevate a rescue into a diplomatic incident with major political implications, or provide an opportunity for the kind of decisive action that might advance his career. "Ma'am," the deputy said to Emma, his tone becoming more formal, "I'm going to need you to come with us back to Fort Bridger so we can sort this out properly. The territorial governor will want to hear about this incident." "There's nothing to sort out," Emma protested. "I helped an injured man, and now his family has come to take him home. That's the end of the story." But Tall Bear stepped forward, his expression grave. "No, Emma Carson, this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of something much larger." He turned to address the deputy marshal directly, his English clear and precise, despite his obvious pain from his healing wound. "I am Tall Bear, who walks with thunder, grandson of Chief Standing Eagle. This woman saved my life when white criminals left me to die. By the laws of my people, she is now under our protection. Any threat to her is a threat to our entire nation." The declaration sent a visible shock through the assembled white riders. Emma could see them struggling to process the implications of what they had just heard. They had come expecting to rescue a helpless woman from savage attackers, only to discover that she had saved the life of native royalty and was now apparently under the protection of one of the most powerful tribes in the territory. The deputy marshal looked as if he was regretting ever getting involved in this situation. "Sir, I appreciate your gratitude to this woman, but she's a United States citizen and subject to our laws and protection. And she will always have that protection," Running Wolf interjected smoothly. "But she will also have ours. The spirits have marked her as special, and we will honor their choice." Emma felt as if she was watching a chess game being played around her, with herself as one of the pieces. The simple act of pulling a wounded man out of a snowstorm had somehow transformed her into a figure of international significance, claimed by both white and native authorities as being under their protection. Rhea Thompson, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Emma, what do you want to do? This is your choice to make." It was a simple question, but it cut through all the political posturing and cultural tensions to the heart of the matter. Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her, both white and native, and realized that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of relations between the two peoples. "I want to go home," she said finally, "to my trading post, where I can continue doing what I've always done, treating all people fairly and with respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak." The deputy marshal looked frustrated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure you understand the larger implications of this situation. There are territorial politics at play here that go far beyond your personal preferences. Then, perhaps it's time for those politics to change," Emma replied with growing confidence. "Perhaps it's time for people to stop seeing each other as threats and start seeing each other as neighbors." Running Wolf smiled approvingly. "The spirits chose well when they sent my nephew to your door." But the deputy was not ready to give up. "This matter will have to be reported to the territorial authorities. There will be an investigation into these claims about white criminals attacking Indians." "Good," Tall Bear said firmly. "Let there be an investigation. The men who shot me should be brought to justice, regardless of their race." Stormcaller nodded agreement. "We will provide any assistance needed to find these criminals. Their actions shame all white people, just as bad Indians shame our nation." Emma could see that the confrontation was gradually transforming into something more like a negotiation, with both sides recognizing that they had more to gain from cooperation than from conflict. But she also sensed that this was just the beginning of a much larger drama that would play out over the coming months and years. As the immediate tension began to ease, Emma found herself thinking about the vision that White Crow had supposedly received about sacred white horses surrounding her. She still didn't fully understand what it meant, but she was beginning to grasp that her simple act of compassion had somehow marked her as a bridge between two worlds that had been in conflict for generations. The responsibility was daunting, but as she looked at Tall Bear's grateful face and Running Wolf's proud expression, Emma felt a growing sense that perhaps she was exactly where the spirits intended her to be. The sacred white horses had not yet appeared, but Emma was beginning to understand that when they did, her life would change in ways she could never have imagined. The morning sun painted the frost-covered meadow behind Emma's trading post in shades of gold and pink when the impossible became reality. Emma had risen early to tend to her horses in the barn, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air as she carried feed and water to her animals. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her mind as she worked, and she found herself wondering what the coming weeks would bring now that she had somehow become a focal point of tension between white settlers and the Omaha tribe. She was just finishing her morning chores when she heard a sound unlike anything she had ever experienced. It began as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but there were no storm clouds in the clear morning sky. The sound grew steadily louder and more distinct, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of many horses moving at full gallop across the frozen ground. Emma emerged from the barn and looked toward the western horizon, expecting to see another party of riders approaching her trading post. What she saw instead defied every rational explanation her mind could construct. Across the meadow, emerging from the morning mist like creatures from a dream, came a herd of horses unlike any Emma had ever seen. They were pure white, not the cream or grey that people sometimes called white, but a luminous pearl-like white that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Their manes and tails flowed like silk in the wind as they ran, and their hoofbeats created a music that resonated not just in Emma's ears, but in her very bones. There were dozens of them, possibly more than 100, moving in perfect formation across the snow-covered meadow. They ran with a grace and power that spoke of supernatural origin, their movements so coordinated that they seemed to be dancing rather than simply running. As they drew closer, Emma could see that their eyes held an intelligence that was distinctly non-animal, as if ancient spirits had taken equine form to deliver a message from another realm. Emma stood frozen in wonder and terror as the magnificent herd approached her trading post. Every instinct told her to run, to seek shelter from these otherworldly creatures, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. The horses slowed as they neared her property, their formation tightening into a perfect circle with Emma at the center. The lead mare, larger and more magnificent than the others, approached Emma directly. Her coat seemed to shimmer with pearl and silver highlights, and her dark eyes held depths of wisdom that made Emma feel as if she was being evaluated by the divine itself. The mare stopped just 3 feet away from Emma and lowered her great head in what could only be interpreted as a bow of respect. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she was witnessing the fulfillment of White Crow's vision. These were the sacred white horses, and they had come to mark her as chosen by the spirits. The magnitude of the moment overwhelmed her, and she felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the supernatural herd continued their silent vigil around her. The horses remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. During that time, Emma felt a profound sense of peace and purpose settling over her, as if the anxieties and uncertainties that had plagued her since David's death were being lifted away by some benevolent force. She understood, without words or explanations, that her life had taken on a significance far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the sacred white horses began to move again, The lead mare raised her head and gazed into Emma's eyes one final time before turning and leading the herd back across the meadow. They departed as they had, come in perfect formation, their hoofbeats creating that same otherworldly music until they disappeared into the morning mist like a vision from a half-remembered dream. Emma remained standing in her yard for long minutes after the horses had vanished, trying to process what she had just experienced. Part of her wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter, if the stress and isolation of frontier life had finally driven her to hallucinations. But the trampled snow in the meadow provided physical evidence that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. The sound of approaching riders from the direction of the Omaha camp broke Emma from her reverie. She looked up to see Running Wolf and several other tribal elders riding toward her trading post at a steady pace. Their faces bore expressions of anticipation mixed with reverence, and Emma realized they had been expecting this visitation. "You saw them," Running Wolf said as he dismounted near Emma. It was not a question but a statement of certainty. "I saw them," Emma confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They surrounded me, just as White Crow said they would." "Running." Wolf nodded solemnly, then did something that shocked Emma to her core. The dignified elderly diplomat, who had always maintained formal, respectful distance in their previous interactions, knelt in the snow before her and bowed his head. "Great Spirit Woman," he said in Omaha, then repeated in English, "You have been marked by the sacred ones. From this day forward, you walk between worlds as a bridge of peace." The other elders dismounted and followed Running Wolf's example, kneeling in the snow around Emma in positions of profound respect. Emma felt overwhelmed by their reverence, uncomfortable with being treated as some kind of divine figure when she still felt like the same frontier woman who had struggled to survive the winter just days before. "Please," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Please stand up. I don't understand what this means, and I don't feel worthy of such honor." "That is exactly why you are worthy," said an elderly woman whom Emma had not noticed among the riders. She was small and bent with age, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen much and understood more. "I am Singing Crow, keeper of our sacred stories and grandmother to White Crow who received the vision. Those who seek. Power are never chosen by the spirits. Only those who serve others without thought of reward are blessed with such gifts." Singing Crow approached Emma directly, studying her face with intense concentration. "The sacred white horses have appeared to our people only 4 times in our recorded history. Each time they marked the beginning of a new age of understanding between peoples who had been enemies." Emma felt the weight of expectation and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What am I supposed to do? I'm just one person, and I don't have any special powers or abilities." "You have already done it," Singing Crow replied. "You saved Tall Bear's life without knowing who he was or what consequences might follow. You acted with pure compassion, motivated only by the desire to help a fellow human being. That single act has already begun to change the relationship between our peoples." As if summoned by their conversation, another group of riders appeared on the horizon. These were white men, and Emma recognized several faces from the previous day's confrontation. The deputy marshal was among them, along with Mark and Rhea Thompson and several other settlers from the surrounding area. But there were also new faces, including a man in the formal dress of a territorial official and another wearing the collar of a Christian minister. Running Wolf and the other Omaha elders rose to their feet as the white delegation approached, their expressions becoming more guarded as they prepared for another potentially difficult negotiation. Emma found herself once again standing between two groups who viewed each other with suspicion and mistrust. But this time she felt different. About her role, The visitation of the sacred white horses had given her a confidence and sense of purpose that she had never possessed before. The territorial official, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the soft look of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk, dismounted and approached Emma with obvious nervousness. He kept glancing at the assembled Omaha elders as if expecting them to suddenly attack. "Mrs. Carson," he said formally, "I am James Richardson, territorial administrator for this district. I've come to investigate the reports of unusual incidents involving relations between white settlers and the local Indian population." Emma noticed that he addressed her as Mrs. Carson rather than Miss Carson, apparently assuming she was still married. She decided not to correct the misunderstanding, since being perceived as a widow might carry more social weight than being seen as a spinster. "What would you like to know, Mr. Richardson?" Emma asked. Richardson produced a leather portfolio from his saddlebags and opened it to reveal several official-looking documents. "I have reports of an Indian raiding party surrounding your trading post. Claims of criminal activity by white citizens against Indians, and now rumors of some kind of supernatural manifestation involving sacred horses. I need to understand what actually happened here." Emma looked around at the assembled faces, both white and native, and realized that her account of events would likely determine how the territorial authorities chose to respond to the situation. She could minimize the significance of what had occurred, portraying it as a simple case of frontier neighbors helping each other. Or she could tell the full truth and risk being seen as either a dangerous sympathizer with hostile Indians or a delusional woman who had succumbed to frontier madness. "3 days ago," Emma began, choosing her words carefully, "I found a wounded man in my yard during the blizzard. He had been shot by criminals and left to die in the storm. I brought him inside, treated his wounds, and cared for him until the weather cleared. Yesterday his family came looking for him and found him safe." Richardson nodded, making notes on one of his documents. "And this wounded man was an Indian?" "He was Tall Bear, who walks with thunder, grandson of Chief Standing Eagle and heir to leadership of the Omaha Nation," Emma replied, watching Richardson's expression change as he grasped the political significance of her patient's identity. "I see," Richardson said slowly, "and you say he was shot by white criminals." "3 men who were attempting to steal horses from tribal herds," Emma confirmed. "Tall Bear refused to provide information about his people's livestock, so they shot him and left him to freeze to death." The minister, a thin man with intense eyes and prematurely white hair, stepped forward. "Mrs. Carson, are you certain about these accusations? Making false claims against white citizens in favor of Indian testimony could have serious legal consequences." Emma felt a flash of anger at the implication that she might be lying to protect criminals simply because of their race. "Reverend, I'm telling you exactly what happened. I treated Tall Bear's gunshot wound personally, and I heard his account of the attack directly from him." Running Wolf spoke up from behind Emma. "The woman speaks truth. My nephew described his attackers in detail. We will find these men and see that justice is done, whether through your courts or ours." The veiled threat in Running Wolf's words was not lost on the white officials. Richardson's expression grew more concerned as he realized he might be dealing with a situation that could escalate into open conflict between white settlers and one of the most powerful tribes in the territory. "Now, about these reports of sacred horses," Richardson continued, clearly hoping to move to what he probably considered the least credible part of the story. "Several witnesses claim to have seen large numbers of white horses moving across the territory in unusual formations." Emma looked at Singing Crow, who nodded encouragingly. "This morning I witnessed something extraordinary," Emma said. "A herd of white horses, unlike any I've ever seen, surrounded my trading post. They remained for several minutes, then departed as mysteriously as they had come. Richardson exchanged skeptical glances with the minister and the deputy marshal. "Mrs. Carson, wild horses are not uncommon in this territory. Perhaps the stress of recent events caused you to interpret a normal horse sighting as something more significant than it actually was." "These were not wild horses," Singing Crow interjected firmly. "These were the sacred white horses of Omaha legend, and their appearance marks this woman as chosen by the Great Spirit to serve as a bridge between our peoples." The minister's expression grew alarmed. "Madam, I hope you're not suggesting that Mrs. Carson has been involved in pagan religious practices. Such activities would be highly inappropriate for a Christian woman." Emma felt her temper rising at the minister's condescending tone. "Reverend, I have done nothing inappropriate. I helped an injured man, regardless of his race or religion, because that's what Christian charity demands. If you see something wrong with that, perhaps you need to re-examine your own understanding of Christ's teachings." The rebuke clearly stung the minister, who seemed about to respond angrily when Mark Thompson intervened. "Folks, I think we're getting sidetracked here. Emma's been a good neighbor and a fair trader with everyone in this area, white and Indian alike. Whatever happened with these horses, it doesn't change the fact that she did the right thing by helping an injured man." Rhea Thompson nodded in agreement. "Emma's always been welcome at our ranch, and she'll continue to be welcome regardless of what some people might think about her actions." Richardson looked around at the assembled group, clearly trying to gauge the political implications of the various positions being taken. "Mrs. Carson, regardless of the supernatural aspects of this story, the fact remains that you've become involved in a situation with significant political ramifications. The territorial governor will want to meet with you to discuss how this incident should be handled." "What does that mean exactly?" Emma asked. "It means you may be called upon to serve as an intermediary in negotiations between the territorial government and the Omaha Nation," Richardson replied. "Your unique position of trust with both communities makes you potentially valuable in preventing future conflicts." Emma felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a mantle. The sacred white horses had marked her for a purpose she was only beginning to understand, and now the territorial authorities were asking her to fulfill that purpose in ways that could affect thousands of lives. "And if I refuse?" Emma asked. Richardson's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Carson, I hope you understand that refusing to cooperate with territorial authorities in matters of public safety could be seen as obstruction of justice. We're asking for your help in preventing bloodshed between white settlers and Indian tribes. Surely that's a cause worth supporting." Running Wolf stepped closer to Emma, his expression protective. "Great Spirit woman, you are under the protection of the Omaha Nation. No one will force you to do anything against your will." Emma found herself once again caught between competing authorities, both claiming to have her best interests at heart while pursuing their own political agendas. But the memory of the sacred white horses surrounding her with their otherworldly presence gave her strength to chart her own course. "I will meet with the territorial governor," Emma said finally, "but only if representatives of the Omaha Nation are included in all discussions. Whatever role I'm asked to play in future negotiations, it will not be as a tool of either side, but as someone committed to fairness and justice for all people." Richardson nodded, though he looked less than pleased with Emma's conditions. "I'm sure that can be arranged. When would be convenient for you to travel to the territorial capital?" "After Tall Bear has fully recovered from his wounds," Emma replied firmly. "I want to make sure my patient is well before I leave him." Singing Crow smiled approvingly at Emma's response. "The sacred ones chose well. You understand that duty to those in need comes before political convenience." As the various groups began to disperse, Emma found herself reflecting on how dramatically Her life had changed in just a few days. She had gone from being an isolated frontier widow struggling to survive the winter to being a figure of supernatural significance claimed by both white and native communities as essential to their future relations. The sacred white horses had appeared as promised, marking her as chosen by forces beyond human understanding. But Emma was beginning to realize that being chosen by the spirits was not a guarantee of an easy life. Instead, it was a calling to serve something larger than herself, even when that service required difficult choices and personal sacrifice. As she watched the last of the official delegation ride away toward Fort Bridger, Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Tall Bear standing beside her, his wounded arm supported by a sling, but his eyes bright with determination. "You have accepted a great burden," he said quietly. "Are you certain you're prepared for what lies ahead?" Emma looked out across the meadow where the sacred white horses had performed their mystical dance just hours before. The trampled snow remained as proof that the encounter had been real, not a product of her imagination or wishful thinking. "I'm not sure anyone can be prepared for something like this," Emma replied honestly, "but I know I can't turn away from it. Those horses didn't surround me by accident, and you didn't stumble into my yard by coincidence. There's a purpose to all of this, even if I don't fully understand it yet." Tall Bear nodded with satisfaction. "That wisdom will serve you well. In the trials ahead, the path of the bridge builder is never easy, but it is always necessary." As the sun climbed higher in the winter sky, Emma Carson stood in her yard and contemplated the extraordinary journey that lay before her. The sacred white horses had marked her as chosen, but now she had to prove herself worthy of that divine selection. The fate of two peoples might depend on her ability to find common ground where none had existed before, and Emma was determined not to fail in that sacred trust. The territorial capital of Cheyenne buzzed with tension as Emma Carson arrived. On the crisp March morning, 6 weeks after the sacred white horses had transformed her from an obscure frontier trader into a figure of regional significance. The journey from her trading post had taken 4 days through muddy spring roads, accompanied by both Running Wolf and Tall Bear as representatives of the Omaha Nation, along with Deputy Marshal Kane as her official escort. Emma had never seen a city larger than Fort Bridger, and Cheyenne's bustling streets filled with carriages, merchants, and well-dressed citizens intimidated her more than she cared to admit. The wooden sidewalks clattered under the boots of businessmen hurrying between appointments, while ladies in elaborate dresses picked their way carefully around mud puddles that could ruin expensive fabrics. The contrast between this civilized world and the raw frontier existence she knew so well made Emma acutely aware of how out of place she must appear. Governor Samuel Crawford had arranged for Emma and her companions to stay at the Frontier Hotel, the finest accommodation in the territory. Though the arrangement had caused considerable controversy among Cheyenne's social elite, the idea of housing Indians in their most prestigious establishment had generated heated discussions in parlors and newspaper offices throughout the city. Emma had insisted that if Running Wolf and Tall Bear were not welcome at the hotel, she would camp outside the city rather than accept hospitality denied to her friends. The meeting with Governor Crawford was scheduled for that afternoon in the Territorial Capitol building, but Emma had requested a morning to explore the city and gather her thoughts before the crucial negotiations. As she walked the main streets, with Tall Bear beside her, she noticed the stares and whispered conversations that followed their progress. A young white woman, escorted by a clearly high-ranking native man, was an unusual sight that challenged conventional social expectations. "They look at us as if we're creatures in a traveling show," Tall Bear observed quietly as they paused outside a general store whose proprietor had emerged to gawk at them openly. "Let them look," Emma replied with more confidence than she felt. Perhaps it's time they saw that white and native people can walk together as equals. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a well-dressed man in his 50s, whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked him as someone of importance in the territorial hierarchy. His face bore the calculating expression of a politician sizing up potential allies or threats. "Mrs. Carson, I presume," the man said with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Charles Whitman, territorial representative to Congress. I've been eager to meet the woman who's caused such a stir in our peaceful territory." Emma recognized the subtle challenge in Whitman's words and chose to meet it directly. "Congressman Whitman, I'm pleased to meet you, though I should clarify that I haven't caused any disturbances. I simply helped an injured man, and others have chosen to make that assistance into something controversial." Whitman's smile became more genuine, suggesting he appreciated Emma's directness. "Indeed, and that simple act of Christian charity has created opportunities for improved relations with our native neighbors that we haven't seen in decades. I hope you understand the significance of your position." Tall Bear stepped slightly, closer to Emma, his body language protective without being overtly threatening. "Congressman, Mrs. Carson understands very well that some people hope to use her good intentions for their own political purposes." The congressman's expression hardened as he studied Tall Bear more carefully, taking in the fine quality of his clothing and the quiet authority in his bearing. "And you are?" "I am Tall Bear who walks with thunder, grandson of Chief Standing Eagle and heir to leadership of the Omaha Nation," Tall Bear replied formally. "I am here to ensure that Mrs. Carson's generosity is not exploited by those who see her only as a tool for advancing their own interests." Whitman's political instincts were clearly engaged as he processed the implications of dealing with native royalty. "I see. Well, Prince Tall Bear, I hope you understand that all parties involved want what's best for both our peoples. What I understand," Tall Bear said calmly, "is that what's best for your people is not always what's best for mine. That's why Mrs. Carson's role as an honest intermediary is so valuable." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of a newspaper reporter, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the eager expression of someone sensing a significant story. "Mrs. Carson, I'm Jonathan Mills from the Cheyenne Daily Leader. Could I have a few words about your upcoming meeting with the governor?" Emma had been warned by Deputy Marshal Kane that reporters would be interested in her story, but she hadn't expected to be accosted on the street. "I'm not sure there's much to say, Mr. Mills. I'm here to assist with negotiations that might prevent future conflicts between settlers and tribal communities." Mills scribbled notes as she spoke, his eyes bright with professional excitement. "Is it true that you've been marked by sacred Indian spirits as some kind of chosen mediator?" Emma felt her cheeks redden with embarrassment at the sensationalized description of her experience. "I've had some unusual encounters that both native and white religious leaders have interpreted as spiritually significant, but I prefer to focus on practical solutions rather than supernatural explanations." "And what about these reports of sacred white horses appearing to bless your mission?" Mills pressed, sensing he was onto something that would sell newspapers. Tall Bear moved slightly in front of Emma, his expression warning the reporter not to push too far. "Some things are too sacred to be reduced to newspaper gossip," he said firmly. "Mrs. Carson's spiritual experiences are not entertainment for curious readers." Mills looked disappointed, but recognized that he had gotten as much information as he was likely to receive. "Well, perhaps we could arrange a more formal interview after your meeting with the governor." "Perhaps," Emma said non-committally, though she privately hoped to avoid further press attention. As Mills departed to write his story, Congressman Whitman stepped closer to Emma with an expression of concern. Mrs. Carson, I hope you understand that everything you say and do while you're in Cheyenne will be scrutinized by both supporters and opponents of improved relations with the tribes. Your words carry weight far beyond what you might expect. Emma appreciated the warning, though. She suspected Whitman's concern was more political than personal. Congressman, I intend to speak honestly about my experiences and my hopes for peaceful coexistence. If that creates problems for some people's political agendas, perhaps those agendas need to be reconsidered. Whitman's expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with Emma's response, but before he could reply, they were approached by another figure whose presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation. The newcomer was a woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed, but with calloused hands that spoke of practical experience rather than pampered leisure. Mrs. Carson, the woman said warmly, I'm Margaret Crawford, the governor's wife. I wanted to meet you before this afternoon's formal proceedings. Emma was surprised by the governor's wife approaching her on a public street, and she could see that Congressman Whitman was equally taken aback by this breach of protocol. Mrs. Crawford, it's an honor to meet you. Margaret Crawford's eyes moved to Tall Bear with genuine interest rather than the fear or disdain that most white women showed when encountering native men. And you must be Prince Tall Bear. My husband has spoken of you with great respect. Tall Bear inclined his head politely. Mrs. Crawford, your husband's reputation for fairness is known among my people. I hope that reputation proves justified in today's negotiations, Margaret Crawford replied. There are powerful interests in this territory who profit from conflict and mistrust. They won't welcome efforts to establish genuine peace. The warning was delivered quietly, but its implications were clear. Emma realized she was walking into a political minefield where her naive desire to help people could be twisted into support for agendas she didn't understand or endorse. What kind of interests? Emma asked. Margaret Crawford glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before responding. Men who make money selling weapons and supplies to military expeditions against hostile tribes. Politicians who advance their careers by promising to protect settlers from Indian raids. Businessmen who want tribal lands opened for mining and railroad development. Congressman Whitman looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mrs. Crawford, I hardly think it's appropriate to burden Mrs. Carson with territorial politics before her meeting with the governor. On the contrary, Margaret Crawford replied firmly, I think it's essential that she understand what she's walking into. Mrs. Carson's reputation for honesty and fairness makes her valuable to people who genuinely want peace, but it also makes her dangerous to those who profit from war. Emma felt a chill as she grasped the implications of what the governor's wife was telling her. Are you saying I might be in danger? I'm saying you should be very careful about who you trust and what commitments you make, Margaret Crawford replied. The sacred white horses may have marked you as chosen by spiritual forces, but earthly forces can be just as powerful and far more ruthless. Tall Bear's expression had grown grim as he listened to this exchange. Mrs. Crawford speaks wisdom. Among my people, we know that bridge builders often become targets for those who prefer the safety of their own side of the river. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Running Wolf, who had been meeting with other tribal representatives who had come to Cheyenne for the negotiations. The elderly diplomat's face bore signs of frustration and concern that suggested his morning had not gone well. Great Spirit Woman, Running Wolf said to Emma, using the title the Omaha people had bestowed upon her. We must speak privately before you meet with the White Chief. Margaret Crawford nodded understanding. Of course. But remember what I've told you, Mrs. Carson. Not everyone who claims to want peace actually desires it. As the governor's wife departed, Emma found herself wondering if she had been naive to think that her simple act of helping an injured man could somehow bridge decades of mistrust and conflict. The political complexities she was encountering in Cheyenne were far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything she had dealt with on the frontier. Running Wolf led Emma and Tallbear to a quiet park where they could speak without being overheard by curious observers or potential eavesdroppers. His expression was troubled as he began to share what he had learned during his morning meetings. The white leaders are divided into different groups with different goals, Running Wolf explained. Some truly want peace and see you as a way to achieve it. Others want to use your influence to pressure our people into accepting unfavorable agreements. Still others see you as a threat to their plans for taking our lands. Emma felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation she had stumbled into. What do the tribal representatives want from me? They want assurance that you will not be used as a tool to legitimize stealing our territories, Running Wolf replied. Many tribal leaders remember previous white mediators who promised fairness but ultimately served only white interests. Tallbear added his own perspective. There are also some among our people who question whether any white person can truly represent our interests, regardless of their intentions. They see your role as evidence that we are becoming too dependent on white approval. Emma sat down on a park bench, feeling the weight of expectations and suspicions from all sides pressing down on her like a physical burden. Maybe I should just go home, she said quietly. I'm clearly not qualified to mediate these kinds of complex political disputes. The sacred white horses did not choose you because you were qualified, Running Wolf said gently. They chose you because you have something more valuable than political experience. You have a pure heart that seeks only to help others, regardless of their race or station. But how do I help when everyone wants to use me for their own purposes? Emma asked. Tallbear sat beside her on the bench, his expression thoughtful. By staying true to the principles that brought you to this moment, you saved my life because it was the right thing to do, not because you hoped to gain anything from it. Apply that same moral clarity to every decision you make here. There, conversation was interrupted by the approach of Deputy Marshal Kane, who had been serving as Emma's official escort throughout the journey to Cheyenne. His expression was tense as he hurried toward their secluded meeting spot. "Mrs. Carson," Kane called out, "you need to return to the hotel immediately. There's been a development that changes everything." Emma felt her heart sink as she recognized the urgency in Kane's voice. "What kind of development?" "The 3 men who shot Prince Tallbear have been arrested," Kane replied. "They're being held in the territorial jail, and they're claiming they were acting on orders from someone important, someone who wanted to provoke a conflict between white settlers and the Omaha tribe." The implications of this revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. If Tallbear's attackers had been working for someone with political motivations, then her entire understanding of recent events would need to be reconsidered. The random criminal assault she had assumed was behind. Tallbear's shooting might actually have been part of a larger conspiracy to create the very conflicts she was now being asked to help resolve. "Who gave them orders?" Tallbear asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Kane shook his head. "They're not talking yet, but the Territorial Attorney General wants to interview Mrs. Carson about her knowledge of the incident before proceeding with the prosecutions." Emma felt the political ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that her role in recent events might be more complicated than anyone had initially understood. If the attack on Tallbear had been orchestrated to achieve specific political goals, then her rescue of him might have inadvertently disrupted someone's carefully laid plans. "We need to get back to the hotel," Running Wolf said firmly. "This changes the nature of today's negotiations significantly." As they hurried through Cheyenne's busy streets toward the Frontier Hotel, Emma found herself wondering if the sacred white horses had appeared not just to mark her as a bridge builder, but to warn her that she was walking into a web of deception and manipulation far more complex than she had ever imagined. The afternoon meeting with Governor Crawford would now take on an entirely different character, with Emma potentially serving not just as a mediator between white and native communities, but as a key witness in a criminal conspiracy that threatened to expose the darker forces working to prevent peace in the Wyoming Territory. The sacred white horses had chosen her for this moment, but Emma was beginning to understand that divine selection didn't guarantee earthly success. The forces arrayed against peace were powerful and ruthless, and they would not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened their profitable conflicts. As Emma entered the Frontier Hotel and prepared for the most important afternoon of her life, she drew strength from the memory of those magnificent white horses surrounding her with their otherworldly presence. Whatever trials lay ahead, she would face them with the same moral clarity that had led her to pull a wounded stranger from a deadly blizzard. The truth about Tallbear's shooting would soon be revealed, and with it, Emma would discover whether her role as a bridge between worlds would lead to genuine peace or make her a target for those who preferred the profits of war to the challenges of understanding. The territorial courthouse erupted in chaos as Attorney General Harrison Blackwood read the confession that would shake the foundations of Wyoming Territory politics. Emma Carson sat in the witness gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as she listened to revelations that transformed her understanding of everything that had transpired since that snowy morning when she pulled Tallbear from the blizzard. The defendants Frank Morrison, Pete Kowalski, and Billy Henderson have confessed to the attempted murder of Tallbear who walks with thunder, Blackwood announced to the packed courtroom. Furthermore, they have provided evidence that they were hired by Territorial Land Commissioner Vincent Sterling to assassinate the Omaha Prince and make it appear to be the work of rival tribes. The confession detailed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Sterling, who controlled vast tracts of land designated for eventual white settlement, had orchestrated Tallbear's attempted murder to provoke a war between the Omaha tribe and neighboring Cheyenne bands. Such a conflict would justify military intervention, the confiscation of tribal territories, and the opening of millions of acres for white development. Emma felt sick as she grasped the magnitude of the plot that had nearly succeeded. If she hadn't found Tallbear in time, if the young prince had died in that blizzard, the resulting tribal war could have led to the destruction of both Omaha and Cheyenne communities while enriching Sterling and his political allies. Governor Crawford's voice cut through the courtroom murmur as he stood to address the assembly. Let the record show that Vincent Sterling has been stripped of all territorial appointments and will face charges of conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the territorial government. His actions have brought shame upon our administration and betrayed the trust of all citizens, both white and native. Emma watched as Sterling was led away in shackles, his face pale with the knowledge that his carefully constructed political career was ending in disgrace. The man who had hoped to profit from racial conflict was now facing years in territorial prison, his vast land holdings subject to seizure by the government he had tried to manipulate. But the revelation of Sterling's conspiracy was only the beginning of a day that would reshape the relationship between white settlers and native tribes throughout the territory. Governor Crawford had used the exposure of the plot to call for an unprecedented peace conference, bringing together chiefs from 5 different tribes with territorial officials committed to establishing lasting agreements based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Chief Standing Eagle rose from his seat in the front row of the courtroom, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. The elderly Omaha leader had traveled from his village specifically for these proceedings, and his words would carry tremendous weight with both native and white communities. My grandson was saved by a woman whose heart knows no boundaries of race or tribe, Standing Eagle said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Emma Carson risked her life to preserve his, asking nothing in return except that he recover his strength. This is the kind of courage that builds bridges between peoples who have been enemies. Emma felt tears threatening as the chief continued his speech, praising her actions in terms that seemed far too generous for what she still considered a simple act of human decency. The sacred white horses appeared to mark this woman as chosen by the Great Spirit to show us a new path forward, Standing Eagle declared. Today we have seen that path lead to justice for those who would profit from our blood and hope for those who seek peace between our nations. Governor Crawford stepped forward to respond, his expression grave with the weight of history being made in this moment. Chief Standing Eagle, on behalf of the territorial government, I offer our deepest apologies for the actions of corrupt officials who betrayed the trust you placed in us. We propose to establish a new framework for relations between our peoples based on the principles of honesty and mutual benefit that Mrs. Carson has demonstrated. Emma found herself called to the front of the courtroom to witness the signing of what would become known as the Sacred Horse Treaty, the most comprehensive peace agreement between white settlers and native tribes in territorial history. The document established protected reservation boundaries, guaranteed hunting and fishing rights, created joint courts for resolving disputes, and established Emma's trading post as a neutral ground where representatives of all communities could meet for commerce and negotiation. But even more significantly, the treaty included provisions that had never appeared in previous agreements with native peoples. Tribal representatives would serve as equal partners with territorial officials in making decisions about land use and resource development. Native children would receive education in both traditional tribal knowledge and white academic subjects. Intermarriage between whites and native peoples would be legally recognized and protected. As Emma watched the various leaders sign the treaty document, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A random act of compassion during a blizzard had exposed a criminal conspiracy, prevented a devastating war, and created the foundation for a new era of cooperation between peoples who had been enemies for generations. Tall Bear approached Emma as the formal ceremonies concluded, his arm fully healed and his face bright with satisfaction at seeing justice served. The sacred white horses chose their bridge builder well, he said quietly. Without your intervention, many people on both sides would have died in Sterling's manufactured war. I still can't believe that pulling you out of the snow could lead to all of this, Emma replied, gesturing toward the celebration taking place around them as tribal and territorial representatives mingled in the courthouse. That's exactly why it led to this, Tall Bear replied with a smile. You acted without calculating the consequences, motivated only by the desire to help someone in need. That purity of intention gave your actions a power that Sterling's scheming could never match. Running Wolf joined their conversation, his aged face beaming with pleasure at the day's developments. Great Spirit Woman, you have fulfilled the prophecy that White Crow received in his vision. The sacred white horses marked you as the one who would bring peace, and today that peace has been born. Emma felt overwhelmed by the praise and recognition being directed toward her, but she also felt a growing sense of responsibility for maintaining the peace that had been established. This treaty is just the beginning, she said. Making it work will require daily effort from all of us. Which is why we want you to serve as the first Director of Territorial Native Relations, Governor Crawford said, approaching with an official document bearing territorial seals. The position comes with a substantial salary, a house in Cheyenne, and the authority to oversee implementation of the Sacred Horse Treaty. Emma stared at the appointment letter, realizing that accepting it would mean leaving her trading post and the frontier life she had known for years. But she also understood that declining might jeopardize the fragile peace that had been established through so much sacrifice and struggle. "I'm honored by the offer, Governor," Emma said carefully, "but I think I can serve the cause of peace better by remaining at my trading post. It's already established as neutral ground, and it's where people from all communities feel comfortable, coming for help and honest dealing." Chief Standing Eagle nodded approvingly. "The woman shows wisdom. Peace is not built in government offices, but in the daily interactions between ordinary people. Her trading post has already proven its value as a place where trust can be built and understanding can grow." Governor Crawford looked disappointed, but accepted Emma's decision with grace. "Very well, but I hope you'll agree to serve as an unofficial advisor to the territorial government on matters affecting relations with native communities." Emma agreed to that arrangement, recognizing that she could help ensure the treaty's success without abandoning the life and work that had brought her to this moment. As the crowd began to disperse and the various delegations prepared for their journeys home, Emma found herself looking forward to returning to her simple trading post, where the real work of building peace would take place one conversation at a time. The journey back to Sweetwater Creek took 5 days through spring mud and occasional rain, but Emma barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was occupied with plans for expanding her trading post to accommodate the increased traffic that would result from the new treaty arrangements. She would need to build additional storage buildings, hire assistants to help with the increased business, and perhaps establish a small school where children from different communities could learn together. Most importantly, she would need to maintain the atmosphere of trust and fairness that had made her post a natural gathering place for people seeking honest dealing, regardless of their racial or cultural background. The sacred white horses had marked her as a bridge between worlds, but building and maintaining that bridge would require constant vigilance against the forces that preferred division to unity. 2 months after the signing of the Sacred Horse Treaty, Emma stood in her expanded trading post, watching a scene that would have been impossible just a year earlier. Omaha children played alongside the sons and daughters of white settlers, while their parents conducted business in multiple languages. A Cheyenne medicine woman shared healing knowledge with the territorial doctor who had come to establish a clinic in the growing community. Young couples from different tribes and backgrounds sought Emma's advice about marriage and building families that honored multiple traditions. The changes had not come without challenges. Some white settlers remained suspicious of native customers, while some tribal members questioned whether increased contact with white communities would dilute their traditional cultures. Emma had worked tirelessly to address these concerns, using her unique position of trust with all parties to facilitate understanding and compromise. The success of the Sweetwater Creek model had attracted national attention, with journalists and government officials traveling from as far as Washington, D.C., to observe the unprecedented cooperation between white and native communities. Emma found herself corresponding with Indian agents and territorial governors from other regions, seeking advice on implementing similar programs in their jurisdictions. But the most meaningful validation of her work came on a crisp autumn morning when the sacred white horses appeared for the second time. Emma was working in her garden behind the trading post when she heard that familiar, otherworldly rumble of hoofbeats approaching across the prairie. This time, Emma was not alone when the magnificent herd materialized from the morning mist. Tall Bear was visiting to discuss plans for a joint hunting expedition that would include both Omaha and white participants. Running Wolf had come to mediate a minor dispute between tribal members and settlers over grazing rights. The territorial doctor was treating patients in his new clinic, while children from several communities played in the trading post's expanded yard. As the sacred white horses surrounded the entire settlement in their mystical formation, Emma watched the faces of everyone present light up with wonder and reverence. White and native people stood side by side, all equally awed by the spiritual manifestation that blessed their shared community. The lead mare approached Emma once again, her pearl-white coat shimmering with otherworldly light. But this time, instead of simply bowing her great head, the magnificent creature gently nuzzled Emma's shoulder before turning to acknowledge Tall Bear, Running Wolf, and the children who had gathered to witness the miracle. The message was clear to everyone present. The sacred white horses were not just blessing Emma's individual efforts, but celebrating the community of peace and understanding that had grown around her trading post. The bridge between worlds was no longer dependent on a single person, but had become a living reality sustained by the daily choices of dozens of people committed to treating each other with dignity and respect. As the sacred herd departed for the second time, fading into the prairie mist like a vision from a half-remembered dream, Emma felt a profound sense of completion. She had been chosen by forces beyond human understanding to serve as a catalyst for peace, but the real work had been done by ordinary people choosing to see past their differences to their shared humanity. The girl who had once struggled alone in a frontier trading post had become the center of a thriving community where children grew up speaking multiple languages, where healing knowledge was shared freely between cultures, and where the color of someone's skin mattered far less than the content of their character. Years later, when Emma Carson Montgomery had married Dr. Marcus Webb and raised children who considered themselves equally at home in Omaha villages and territorial towns, she would tell her grandchildren about the morning when wounded stranger changed everything. She would describe the sacred white horses and the miracle of transformation that began with a simple act of compassion during a winter blizzard. But the most important part of the story, Emma always emphasized, was not the supernatural manifestations or the political treaties. The most important part was the daily choice to see other people as fellow human beings, deserving of respect and kindness, regardless of the differences that might separate them. The sacred white horses had marked her as chosen, but Emma had learned that everyone was chosen in their own way to build bridges of understanding in a world that too often preferred the safety of division to the challenge of unity. The blessing was not reserved for special people in extraordinary circumstances, but available to anyone willing to risk their comfort to help someone in need. The trading post at Sweetwater Creek continued to thrive for decades, serving as a model for cooperation that inspired similar communities across the American frontier. And sometimes, on particularly clear mornings when the mist rose from the prairie, visitors claimed they could still see the ghostly forms of white horses running across the distant meadows, blessing a land where peace had taken root and flourished. Against all odds. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.